Good evening. Tonight we begin with something that sits at the intersection of conflict and memory. Not memory in the abstract sense, but memory carved into stone, set into walls, framed by centuries of architecture. Because across parts of Iran, several historic cultural sites have been damaged. Not by direct targeting, but by the force and shockwaves of nearby blasts during the ongoing Israeli bombing campaign. And when we say historic cultural sites, we are not talking about ordinary buildings. Before we move forward, a thoughtful, fact-driven analysis matters to you. I invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can stay fully informed. Now, we are talking about locations that have stood for generations. Places that represent national heritage, preserved landmarks that carry the weight of time. The damage came as strikes hit areas in Tehran and Isfahan. Those strikes produced powerful shockwaves, and those shockwaves traveled outward, across streets, across neighborhoods, across spaces where centuries-old structures have stood. In Tehran, one of the locations affected was the Golestan Palace, a site long recognized as an important part of Iran's cultural history. The palace complex is known for its historic architecture and its role as a cultural landmark within the city. During the strikes in the surrounding area, the force of nearby explosions reached the palace grounds. Shockwaves from the blasts caused visible damage to parts of the structure. Windows were shattered. Fragments of debris struck sections of the site. Masonry was dislodged from portions of the building. Stone that had remained in place for decades, sometimes far longer, was shaken loose by the pressure from explosions occurring nearby. The damage was not isolated. In Isfahan, another location experienced similar effects. The Chehel Sotoon Palace, a historic pavilion known for its architecture and cultural importance. It too was affected by shockwaves created by nearby strikes. Again, the pattern was similar. Windows broken, sections of masonry loosened, debris scattering across areas that are typically preserved with great care. These were not combat structures. They are cultural landmarks, sites associated with heritage and history, the type of places that are normally maintained and protected for their historical value. And yet the force generated by nearby bombing was enough to reach them, enough to disturb structures that had stood in relative stability for generations. Officials in Iran reported that debris from the surrounding blasts traveled into the heritage locations. Glass from shattered windows scattered across palace interiors and courtyards. Pieces of masonry fell from exterior walls. Sections of historic construction were shaken by the blast pressure. Even when the buildings themselves were not directly struck, the energy of the explosions carried far enough to leave a mark. And that is the central point here. The damage being described did not require a direct hit. The shockwaves alone were enough. Shockwaves moving outward from strikes in Tehran and Isfahan. Shockwaves moving through air and ground, reaching sites that represent centuries of cultural preservation. The development quickly drew international attention because some of the locations involved fall under international cultural protection frameworks. And when those protections are placed at risk, organizations that monitor heritage preservation take notice. UNESCO was among those organizations responding. The organization expressed concern over the impact of the strikes on protected cultural landmarks. Concern focused specifically on the potential damage to sites recognized for their historical and cultural significance. UNESCO's role in these situations is centered on the preservation of heritage. Locations designated for cultural protection are monitored because they represent history that extends far beyond modern political conflicts. And when damage occurs to those locations, it raises alarms among preservation groups. In this case, UNESCO's concern was tied directly to the reports emerging from Tehran and Isfahan. Reports describing broken windows, dislodged masonry, structural damage linked to the shockwaves from nearby blasts. The damage may not have come from direct targeting, but the effects were real. Historic sites affected, architectural features disturbed, structures altered by forces generated during the bombing campaign. Iranian officials responded strongly to these developments. Government representatives criticized the strikes. They pointed to the cultural damage being reported at heritage sites. and they warned about what they described as cultural losses resulting from the bombardment. Their statements focused on the idea that these landmarks represent national heritage, places that hold historical significance, places that are part of the country's cultural identity. And when those sites are damaged, even indirectly, the impact reaches beyond the physical structure itself. It touches something deeper, something tied to preservation, to memory, to the idea that certain places carry the imprint of history. One Iranian official described the damage in terms of cultural loss, not only structural damage, but the loss that comes when historic places are affected by modern conflict. The statement did not add new details about the strikes themselves, but it emphasized the importance of the heritage sites involved, and the concern that damage to those locations represents something larger, something that extends beyond a single event. There is a moment in situations like this when the conversation shifts, when attention moves from the immediate blast to what surrounds it, from the strike itself to the structures that have stood nearby for generations. Structures that were never built with modern warfare in mind. Structures built long before these kinds of weapons existed, and yet they remain in the path of their effects, even when the target lies elsewhere, even when the blast occurs nearby. One quiet reflection captures the feelings surrounding moments like this. We build things to last, and hope time will be kind to them. That sentiment does not change the facts, but it reflects the human reaction when something old, something preserved, suddenly shows signs of damage. Tonight, the facts remain straightforward. During the ongoing U.S. Israeli bombing campaign, strikes in Tehran and Isfahan produced shockwaves strong enough to reach nearby heritage sites. The Golestan Palace in Tehran sustained damage from debris and blast pressure. The Chehel Sotoon Palace in Isfahan experienced similar effects. Windows shattered, masonry dislodged, historic structures disturbed by nearby explosions. UNESCO expressed concern over the impact on protected cultural landmarks. Iranian officials criticized the strikes and warned of cultural losses tied to the damage. Those are the confirmed developments. And they form the starting point of what is now an unfolding situation involving cultural heritage and modern conflict. Because once damage occurs to a historic landmark, attention shifts to preservation, to documentation, to the long process of understanding exactly what was lost and what can still be protected. And that is where this continues. The developments surrounding the damaged heritage sites did not unfold in isolation. They emerged within the broader context of the ongoing U.S. Israeli bombing campaign, where strikes were carried out in multiple areas. Among the locations affected by nearby blasts were Tehran and Isfahan, two cities that hold numerous historic landmarks. In Tehran, the Golestan Palace stands as one of the most recognizable historic complexes in the country. It is a site closely associated with Iran's architectural and cultural heritage. The palace complex has long been regarded as an important cultural landmark within the capital. When nearby strikes occurred in Tehran, the force generated by the explosions did not remain confined to the immediate strike locations. Shockwaves spread outward. They moved through the surrounding environment, reaching areas where historic structures stand. At the Golestan Palace, those shockwaves caused damage to parts of the site. Windows within sections of the complex were shattered by the blast pressure. Glass fragments scattered across interior and exterior spaces. Debris carried by the force of the nearby explosions struck parts of the palace structures. In addition to broken windows, sections of masonry were dislodged. Stone and structural elements that had remained intact for long periods were shaken loose. These were not isolated cracks or minor disturbances. Reports described pieces of historic construction being displaced by the force of the blasts occurring nearby. The palace itself was not the target of the strikes, but the energy produced by the nearby bombing was strong enough to reach the site. And when shockwaves encounter historic structures, the results can appear suddenly. Glass shattering, stone loosening, fragments falling where they had once remained fixed. The situation in Isfahan followed a similar pattern. There, the Chehel Sotoon Palace was among the heritage sites affected. The structure is known for its historic architecture and its presence within a cultural landscape that has been preserved for generations. During strikes carried out in the surrounding area, powerful explosions produced shockwaves that extended beyond the immediate strike zones. Those shockwaves reached the grounds and structures of the Chehel Sotoon Palace. As in Tehran, the effects included shattered windows. Glass that had once framed the palace interiors broke under the pressure from the blasts. Fragments scattered across the site. Sections of masonry were also reported to have been dislodged. Portions of the structure that had been stable for long periods were shaken by the nearby detonations. Debris carried through the air reached parts of the palace. The result was visible damage at a location that is widely recognized for its cultural significance. The pattern emerging across both cities was consistent. Historic landmarks located near areas where bombing occurred were affected by the resulting shockwaves. Even without a direct strike, the force generated by nearby explosions was capable of causing structural damage. Windows are often among the most vulnerable elements in historic buildings. They can shatter under intense pressure changes. And once windows break, debris can travel further inside the structure. Masonry, particularly older masonry, can also respond to shockwaves. When blast pressure moves through the air, it can cause vibrations in nearby structures. Those vibrations can loosen stone and construction materials that have remained in place for decades or even centuries. The reports from Tehran and Isfahan described exactly those kinds of effects. Glass broken by pressure, stone shifted by vibration, fragments scattered within historic sites. These developments drew international attention quickly. When cultural landmarks are affected by nearby military activity, preservation organizations begin monitoring this situation closely. Among the organizations that responded was UNESCO. UNESCO expressed concern regarding the reported damage to heritage sites. The organization's concern focused on the impact of nearby strikes on protected cultural landmarks. Sites that fall under heritage protection are recognized for their cultural value. They are monitored because they represent history that extends across generations. When damage occurs to those sites, even if indirectly, it raises questions about preservation and protection. UNESCO's statement reflected that concern. The organization emphasized the importance of safeguarding cultural landmarks, particularly those that are recognized as part of the world's shared cultural heritage. In this situation, the concern centered on the shockwave damage reported at the Golestan Palace and the Chehel Sotoon Palace. Both locations are known for their historical significance. Both have long been regarded as part of Iran's cultural heritage, and both were affected by nearby blasts during the bombing campaign. The response from Iranian officials followed quickly. Government representatives criticized the strikes. Their statements pointed directly to the damage reported at the heritage locations. Officials warned that the bombardment had caused cultural losses. They emphasized that the affected sites represent more than architectural structures. They represent heritage, places connected to the country's historical identity. When those places are damaged, the loss is described not only in terms of broken glass or displaced stone. It is described in terms of cultural impact. Officials spoke about the importance of preserving historic landmarks. They warned that the damage caused by nearby blasts represents the loss for cultural preservation. Their statements did not introduce new technical details about the strikes themselves, but they highlighted the significance of the sites involved. Locations that have stood as cultural landmarks for generations. Locations where architecture and history intersect. And locations now experiencing the effects of nearby military activity. The reaction surrounding these developments reflects a broader reality. Historic structures are often located within modern cities. Cities that grow, expand, and change over time. Within those cities, landmarks from earlier eras remain. Preserved buildings, historic palaces, cultural sites that have been maintained across decades. When modern conflict occurs within or near those urban environments, the effects can extend beyond the intended targets. Shockwaves travel. Pressure moves through the air. Vibrations reach buildings that were never designed to withstand such forces. The events reported in Tehran and Isfahan illustrate that reality. Strikes carried out nearby produced blast pressure strong enough to affect historic structures. Damage appeared in the form of shattered windows and dislodged masonry. debris from nearby explosions reached heritage sites. And those developments triggered responses from international organizations and national officials. In moments like this, there is often a quiet recognition of what historic places represent. They are reminders of earlier generations. They carry architectural traditions. They stand as markers of cultural continuity. And when damage appears on those structures, the reaction can be immediate and emotional. One line often captures that feeling with simple clarity. Some places hold time inside their walls. That thought does not change the details being reported, but it reflects why the damage to heritage sites draws attention beyond the immediate location. Because those structures connect present moments with the past. Tonight, the facts remain unchanged. During strikes in Tehran and Isfahan as part of the ongoing Stat Israeli bombing campaign, shockwaves from nearby blasts caused damage to historic cultural sites. At the Golestan Palace in Tehran, windows were shattered and masonry was dislodged. At the Chehel Sotoon Palace in Isfahan, similar damage occurred, with broken windows and structural disturbance caused by blast pressure. Debris from nearby explosions reached the heritage locations. UNESCO expressed concern over the impact on protected cultural landmarks. Iranian officials criticized the strikes and warned of cultural losses tied to the bombardment. These are the confirmed developments as they stand now, and they lead to the final part of this account. As the reports from Tehran and Isfahan circulated, attention increasingly centered on what the damage represented beyond the immediate structural impact. Because the locations involved were not ordinary buildings. They were cultural landmarks, places that carry historical meaning preserved across generations. When blast shockwaves reached the Golestan Palace in Tehran and the Chehel Sotoon Palace in Isfahan, the physical damage became one part of a larger concern surrounding cultural preservation. Windows shattered, stone loosened, fragments scattered across heritage sites that are typically maintained with careful protection. Even when the structures themselves were not directly struck, the nearby blasts produced pressure strong enough to disturb elements of the buildings. And when that happens at historic sites, the consequences extend into the realm of cultural heritage. The Golestan Palace has long stood as a historic complex within Tehran. It represents architectural traditions and historical continuity. Within its grounds and structures, generations of preservation efforts have worked to maintain the palace's original features. When shockwaves from nearby strikes reached the complex, the resulting damage altered parts of that preserved environment. Broken windows introduced debris into areas that normally remain protected. Sections of masonry were displaced by vibrations caused by the nearby explosions. Stone that had been part of the palace's structure for long periods was shaken loose. These changes, even when limited in scope, drew attention because of the site's cultural importance. In Isfahan, the Chehel Sotoon Palace holds similar significance. The structure is recognized for its historic design and its place within the broader cultural landscape of the city. It has been preserved as an example of historical architecture. During the nearby strikes, the blast pressure from the explosions moved outward into surrounding areas. When those shockwaves reached the palace grounds, the effects became visible. Windows shattered under the pressure. Glass fragments scattered across interior and exterior spaces. Masonry elements were dislodged from sections of the structure. These forms of damage do not necessarily destroy a building entirely, but they disrupt structures that have been carefully preserved. They alter materials that have remained stable for long periods. And in historic locations, even limited structural disturbance becomes significant because it affects the original fabric of the building. The developments prompted international reaction. UNESCO, the organization responsible for monitoring and protecting cultural heritage, expressed concern about the reported damage. The organization's concern focused on the effect of nearby bombing on protected cultural landmarks. Heritage sites that fall within international preservation frameworks are recognized not only for their national importance, but also for their broader cultural value. When those sites experience damage, organizations responsible for cultural protection respond by raising awareness and monitoring the situation. In this case, UNESCO's concern centered on the potential impact of blast shockwaves on historic structures. The organization emphasized the importance of protecting cultural landmarks from harm during periods of conflict. Sites such as the Golestan Palace and the Chehel Sotoon Palace represent historical continuity. They serve as preserved spaces where architecture and cultural identity intersect. When damage occurs to those locations, it raises questions about preservation and restoration. And it places attention on the broader issue of safeguarding cultural heritage during military operations. At the national level, Iranian officials responded with criticism of the strikes. Government representatives pointed to the damage reported at the heritage sites. They described the developments as cultural losses resulting from the bombardment. Their statements emphasized that the affected locations are part of Iran's historical identity. Officials highlighted the importance of protecting heritage landmarks. They warned that the damage caused by nearby blasts represented a loss tied to cultural preservation. The language used in those responses focused on the cultural significance of the sites involved, places that represent architecture, history, and national heritage. Places that are preserved not only for their physical structures, but also for the history they represent. The official statements did not alter the facts surrounding the strikes, but they framed the damage within the context of cultural impact. When a historic site experiences structural disturbance, the loss is often described in terms of heritage, not only in terms of broken materials, but in terms of what those materials represent. Across the international community, cultural preservation organizations often monitor conflicts where historic landmarks exist nearby. The concern arises from the reality that modern warfare can produce effects far beyond the immediate strike zone. Shockwaves travel through the air. Pressure moves outward. Vibrations reach buildings that were constructed in eras long before modern weapons existed. Historic palaces, monuments, and architectural sites were not designed to withstand those forces. They were designed in earlier centuries, often with craftsmanship intended to last across generations. But even the strongest historical construction can respond to the intense energy produced by nearby explosions. That is what occurred in Tehran and Isfahan. Strikes in surrounding areas generated blast pressure strong enough to affect heritage sites. Shockwaves caused windows to shatter. Vibrations loosened masonry. Debris reached structures preserved for their cultural significance. The resulting damage placed these landmarks into the center of international discussion about cultural protection. Preservation experts often emphasize that historic sites represent more than physical buildings. They represent cultural memory, architecture from earlier periods, design traditions that reflect the societies that built them. When damage appears on those structures, the loss is measured not only in materials, but also in historical continuity. Even when repairs can eventually be made, the original materials and conditions may never be fully restored. That reality contributes to the concern expressed by organizations focused on cultural preservation. Because once a historic element is disturbed, the process of restoration becomes complex. It requires careful documentation. It requires preservation expertise. And sometimes the original condition of the site cannot be fully recreated. In moments like this, people often pause to reflect on the meaning of heritage itself. The buildings that survive across centuries become markers of time. They connect modern life with earlier generations. They stand quietly within cities that continue to change around them. And when those structures experience damage, the reaction can carry a sense of loss that goes beyond the visible cracks or broken glass. One line often captures that feeling in simple language. History lives in the places we choose to protect. That sentence does not change the facts that have been reported, but it reflects why the damage to heritage sites draws international concern. Because those places represent preserved connections to the past. Tonight, the confirmed developments remain clear. During the ongoing U.S. Israeli bombing campaign, strikes in Tehran and Isfahan produced shockwaves strong enough to reach nearby historic landmarks. At the Golestan Palace in Tehran, debris shattered windows and dislodged masonry. At the Chehel Sotoon Palace in Isfahan, similar damage occurred from blast pressure generated by nearby explosions. UNESCO expressed concern about the impact of the strikes on protected cultural landmarks. Iranian officials criticized the strikes and warned of cultural losses caused by the bombardment. These developments form the complete account based on the reported information.